Welcome to Betrayal Trauma Recovery, BTR.org. I'm Anne. I'm sure you remember what it was like when you were searching for help, maybe for your husband, hoping to find the right program or therapist. That's why I started podcasting. I supported my husband through 7 years of pornography addiction recovery, and not one therapist during that time told me I was experiencing emotional and psychological abuse and sexual coercion. I didn't want any other woman on the planet to be in the dark. If you're like the majority of my listeners, you're experiencing the type of abuse that's invisible and difficult to wrap your head around. Your husband is using porn or having affairs or lying to you, and you're getting the same bad advice about how to improve communication or your relationship. If you need support from women who totally understand, check out our daily group session schedule at btr.org/group. We'd love to see you in a session today. One simple, anonymous way to help spread the word is to click, follow, or subscribe to the Betrayal Trauma Recovery podcast on your favorite podcasting app. While you're there, every 5-star rating helps make this podcast more visible and will help save other women from getting the wrong kind of help, like a couple program that will make this type of abuse worse. For those of you who follow or subscribe to this podcast, thank you so much. Your support means so much to me. I have Kathy, or Justice Jones, on today's episode. She is a justice advocate who promotes outside-the-box solutions and best practice responses to families living under the chronic oppression of abusers and counterparents. I invited her here because the truth about betrayal trauma symptoms is that betrayal trauma symptoms are caused by domestic abuse. So we need to have a discussion about domestic abuse and how professionals are missing it, especially betrayal trauma professionals. They're not identifying the betrayal trauma symptoms as responses to emotional and psychological abuse and sexual coercion. So we're going to talk about that today. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you for having me.
Listeners to my podcast who have experienced this understand on a deeply personal level how the entire system does not understand emotional and psychological abuse, sexual coercion, and the continued abuse post-separation or post-divorce. So let's look at the system as a whole, including court professionals, therapists, all the people involved. When you say trauma-responsive professionals, do you mean people who actually really get it or people who just say they get it? And can you also talk about the difference between those two things?
Yes, certainly. I've been hearing the code word trauma-informed probably for about 10 years in national conferences and the like. And it quickly became apparent to me that just because you're trauma-informed doesn't mean that you're responsive. It doesn't mean that you take the knowledge that has been imparted to you and actually work towards the benefit and the healing of the survivor. Meaning that if you're a trauma-informed professional, trauma-informed is not enough. Even in your good intentions, you may be acting in ways or you may be putting the survivor in situations that actually aggravate or re-traumatize that victim.
From my perspective, there's so many so-called betrayal trauma therapists or even pornography addiction recovery therapists or other therapists who say that they're trauma-informed, but they don't understand anything about abuse and abuse dynamics. And so their counsel to the victim ends up harming the victim more.
So the first story that I have for you is 8 years ago, I worked at my local domestic violence crisis center, and I was invited to become part of a local mental health program. And part of their invitation was so that I could inform their practices to have them do domestic violence related issues better than what they knew they were doing. And it was a real opportunity for me. And the first training that I provided for these folks, they were wonderful people, but it became pretty clear pretty quickly that they did not know enough at all about domestic violence and counter-parenting and just any issue related to family violence overall. And so I was compelled to ask the question of the 15 people in the room, they had well over 300 years of real-time practice working with families. And they could only come up with a total of maybe 15 hours altogether of domestic violence or family violence training. And that included their college career. And I was horrified.
That's very typical, or even less than that.
Even less than that. And I committed myself that day to making sure this particular practice got a lot more training than they did. And in fact, they asked me to do a training session for mental health practitioners across the state of New Hampshire. But still, it was not enough to address the dearth of information that goes into the programming for mental health practitioners. Another eye-opening incident, I was conducting a retreat, and we asked the participants, there were about 24 of them in the room, how many of you have been into counseling for addressing the domestic violence issues that you were dealing with? And 23 of those women raised their hand. And then I said, I'd like to ask the question, how many of you were actually helped by that counseling? And none of them raised their hands. And then they started sharing with us stories about how their counselor had actually encouraged them to stay in the abuse, to try a little harder, stay a little longer.
Communicate a little better.
Yeah, communicate a little better.
Tell them what your boundaries are. Tell them what you expect.
I think what was most interesting was that there were women in that room who were also mental health practitioners, and they were really distressed by the line of questioning. And eventually, after conversations after the retreat, one of them got back to me and said, like, that was really eye-opening for me, even though she was one of the people who was acknowledging, hey, mental health practitioners didn't help me. They, in fact, contributed to my trauma.
I've found that the therapists in general do not understand this. When someone goes in for help, they do not approach it from the right angle, especially couple therapy.
Couples therapy should not even be a thing. As soon as domestic violence is identified, an ethical mental health practitioner will say, I'm sorry, I cannot provide services in a conjoint therapeutic session. We need to do this separately.
Even if it's separate, they still don't understand. Like, sometimes that same therapist will relay information from the victim to the perpetrator. Like, hey, she doesn't like it when you yada, yada, which puts her in further danger.
Absolutely. Yep.
It's so, so dangerous. The emotional and psychological abuse and the sexual coercion piece is so misunderstood that I'm concerned about anyone really going to therapy. Not that I'm like anti-therapy. That's not what I'm trying to say. But for victims of abuse, it is not the right way to go if they don't understand that they're being abused, because they don't understand themselves. And because the therapist only knows what they see, they're not going to be able to help that victim identify that they are being abused.
Well, again, I can share another story, this one, my personal account, where I was being abused by my ex-husband and decided to go into couples therapy because that was what I was encouraged to do. But my ex-husband wouldn't go because, I was the one who had all the problem. And I went anyway. It was with a couple who provided the therapy. And they were, again, lovely people. But their words created a lot of damage. And one of the things that they said to me, even after I had disclosed that my ex-husband dumped hot spaghetti sauce on me because I had made spaghetti for dinner instead of pork chops, they said, well, you need to confess your sins to him and ask him for his forgiveness. And I was like, what? And that was the last time I ever went for counseling ever. Again, just like you, I'm not anti-counseling, but mental health practitioners have got to come to a true understanding of domestic violence before they should be providing any kind of level of care for domestic violence and sexual assault and sexual coercion, coercive control victims.
Now, for listeners, many of women come to this podcast because their husband's been using porn or having an affair, and they find out that he's been lying and gaslighting. And so when someone like a guest like you, or when I use the term domestic violence, they kind of are like, oh, well, this must not be for me because this isn't a domestic violence situation. So I tend to use the word domestic abuse to try to like help them understand that it is an abuse issue, but it also is a violence issue. It's emotionally violent. It's psychologically violent.
Yep.
What we do at BTR, which we don't specialize in physical violence per se, but physical violence is never going to happen in a vacuum. It's always going to be preceded by emotional and psychological abuse. So it is under the umbrella, for sure, of domestic violence. Women who you're here and you're hearing this word, if you're like, he doesn't punch me in the face. This isn't a domestic violence issue. It might be an abuse issue. It really is a domestic violence issue. It does fall under that umbrella, and it is violence in emotional and psychological ways.
Absolutely, 100%. And the thing that I would say to those women who are saying that to themselves is the reason why you may not have seen physical violence yet is because the emotional and the non-physical forms of violence that he's using against you are working. They're doing what he wants them to do. But every single abuser is absolutely 100% capable of utilizing that more physical form of violence to maintain their dominance in a relationship. I would say between 60 and 65% of the women that I work with have not experienced a severe physical form of violence. And when I say severe, I'm talking about something other than pushing or pulling.
Even just standing over them.
Punching a wall, throwing things, breaking the victim's things. Those are all physical forms of violence. None of them are okay, by the way. I'm not trying to minimize the effect of those, but I'm saying societally, like, we don't think it's a big deal until these abusers are punching us in the eyes. And there's a lot more that comes before that is part of domestic violence. Even though mental health professionals were kind of the reason to do training, I have to say, to my shame and regret, that domestic violence crisis centers were another reason why. And police departments and judges and guardians ad litem, like the whole totality of systems people out there were the reasons why. But the other reason was I needed to be able to succinctly lay out what are trauma-informed practices, even though I'm very certain there are way more trauma-informed practices. I really tried to boil it down to these 10, what trauma survivors need in order to feel safe. As far as I'm concerned, it's the single most courageous act that any survivor can do, is to become vulnerable enough to say to somebody else, I need help. I can't do this alone.
And then that vulnerable moment, having the trauma compounded, is so difficult. It has happened to so many of us here at BTR, which is exactly why I started BTR, because I spent 7 years with my emotionally and psychologically abusive ex in pornography addiction recovery. No one said anything about abuse.
I'm really sorry.
For 7 years, I'm like under the care of so-called therapeutic professionals, not knowing that I was being abused, not only by my ex, but also
by the system.
By proxy. Yeah, by the system. It was so awful.
I'm really sorry that happened to you.
Well, and that's why I thought, like, I've got to get the word out. Don't go down any other route until you know about abuse. Once you understand abuse really well, and you can say, okay, this isn't abuse, so maybe I can go to therapy. Then you'd be in okay shape. But if you go there first without knowing about abuse, they're not going to help you understand it in general. Maybe someone will. Luckily, some guests on this podcast have shared how they went to a particular therapist and they helped them. So that's good. I'm not trying to say everybody's like that, but it's just a dangerous
And I'm so
situation.
happy to hear those successful stories when they happen. I'm like, yeah.
I know.
But it's very few and far between.
It is.
Unfortunately.
And I do not want to discount your list. But I think it's interesting how some people are like, well, I went to this training. And you could very succinctly spell out what needs to happen or a list of what needs to happen. And the practitioner or court professional or helper thinks, okay, I got it. No problem. And then they talk to the victim and they think, oh, well, this doesn't apply to her because
she's not a victim.
Yeah, because he's telling me this isn't really what's going on. And immediately nothing that they just learned is helpful to her. So you just need people who have been through it, because training doesn't really help professionals either. If they don't truly understand it, they can't get past his manipulation. So
it's an important point, because here's the thing. Anytime you see a list like this, it shouldn't be a check off of, yep, I did that. Yep, I did that. Yep, I did that. These lists should be utilized for you to take a good, long, hard look at how you conduct yourself with, for instance, a trauma survivor, and say, will these people be able to say these things about me? This is really about getting professionals to think, this trauma survivor that I just worked with, who identified herself as a trauma survivor, what is she going to say about me on this app?
The first item on your list is not funny, but I'm smiling to myself a little bit, and I'll tell you why. It says, listen to adult or child victims without blame or judgment. The reason why I am thinking of myself in this moment is because when I hear a victim blame, I listen without blame or judgment, but I always want to sort of set them straight, right? Like, no, this is not your fault. Nope. And it can sound invalidating to victims, which I feel bad about, but I do genuinely want to invalidate the abuse. I want to invalidate the ideas that they have about themselves that came from the abuser that they don't recognize is abuse. It's not their fault that they don't recognize it. It's sort of a catch-22 for someone who understands abuse to listen and redirect the truth of what's going on, which is a totally different thing, and not why you wrote this, because you were intending to call out people who say, well, what could you have done better?
I have to go back and speak to the issue that you were just talking about, because it's not just the abuser that gives the victim the perspective of, well, you're to blame too, and this is what you're doing wrong, and that's what you're doing wrong. Our entire society does it. There's no more popular social activity out there than blaming and hating victims. So for me, this first step is, you've got to listen to somebody who identifies themselves as a victim. You've got to listen to them without adding your own misconceptions and misperceptions about what they're doing, how they added, how they contributed, how they're complicit in their own abuse, because abuse comes from a power over dynamic. And an abuse victim is never a person in power within that specific relationship. So what do I mean by that? If you are somebody who's being abused, you're being abused because the person who abuses you has decided that they are superior to you and that you are inferior to them in every way, shape, and form. With somebody like that, you're not a victim one day and powerful the next day, where you're like fighting back, or a term that I can't stand is resistance abuse. It's not abuse, it's just resistance.
Exactly. Or it's resistance to abuse.
You have a power dynamic of one person who's always dominant over the other. Power and control, coercive control. This is what it's all about. So I like to use the acronym PRICK. Premeditated, repetitive, intentional, conscious, and knowing. That's how abusers work. They do that to establish their dominance as either the partner or as a parent, and they do it with the intention of destroying your ability to have any sense of safety, well-being, or autonomy.
Would you add there as well that they use lying, manipulation, gaslighting to do
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. They use a whole bunch of tools in their tool belt to do that. People will ask me all the time, is it really intentional? Let me tell you how intentional it is. I have another example. My abuser used to sleep at night with his fingers wrapped through my hair, so I
Yikes.
couldn't even get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom without him knowing. So even in his sleep, he was intentional in knowing exactly where I was and what I was doing at all times. So it is true that victims will say things that indicate that they are taking on the blame for abuse that is happening to them. And I think it is perfectly okay. Certainly, I have done it hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, to ask them, can I reframe that for you for a minute? Can we talk about the power dynamic here and what was happening in your mind as you were doing XYZ? Were you doing that in the moment to be dominant over him, or were you trying to get some semblance of self-autonomy back, or were you trying to defend yourself or your children? And so really deconstructing what that victim is calling, I contributed to the abuse, not to deny them their experience, but to say, like, hey, let's reframe this to really think about what was happening here, because self-defense is not abuse.
One of the problems is that abusers will claim that their abuse was self-defense. She wouldn't let me use porn. I just couldn't take it anymore, and I had to take a stand, they might say. But if you ask, what was it that she was pushing for? Truth, transparency, equality.
And again, it's about looking at the totality of that relationship to say, where was your dominance in that moment? You were withholding significant information from her that was causing her to feel like you were not trustworthy as an individual, that you were putting her at risk for sexually transmitted diseases, or that you were belittling or making small the vows of your wedding that she was taking very seriously. Like, there's always that power dynamic that the perpetrator is maintaining that power even as he is trying to get the victim to take the blame for what her reaction may have been in the moment.
We mentioned it just barely about the idea of mutual abuse or reactive abuse. So, for example, you're experiencing abuse, and so you were abusive to him, is this idea that BTR emphatically rejects. You're just resisting, or you're trying to defend yourself from abuse, which is a totally different thing. Can you talk about why maybe the typical therapist might suggest this, or maybe an abuse victim might think that she's being abusive in response to his abuse?
One of the most common ideas around that is it takes two to tango. If you're in counseling, especially in a co-counseling or couples counseling type of therapeutic relationship, it's their nature to find where both parties are at fault.
That's the foundational theoretical underpinning of their training. It's family systems. That is the schooling that they received. I also think that under the certification and licensure, it's unethical for them to pick a side.
Right.
Right. Because of the family systems theory that they've been trained with.
This is kind of an aside, but the more that I've seen the resources that are out there and available, really the only training that I've seen on trauma-informed practices that I think is worthwhile is the training through Dr. Jessica Taylor in the United Kingdom.
I've had her on the podcast before. She's great.
Because she specifically rejects any concept that would rebrand, re-victimize, or make somebody culpable in their own abuse for men's violence against women. She would not pathologize women for being victims of men's violence. Mother Justice Network, by the way, also completely rejects the idea of mutual abuse or reactive abuse.
So many listeners to this podcast, right when they find out about their husband's pornography use, for example, they simultaneously find out that he has been lying to her for years. Most of the time, they're like a church-going type man, right? And so it's assumed that he wouldn't participate in this type of behavior. And so many victims, when they find out, the first thing they do is go to clergy and say, hey, this is what's going on, thinking that maybe clergy can help them. This amounts to a victim disclosing abuse, right? Emotional and psychological abuse, but she might not know that that's what she's doing. And 99% of the time, the clergy does not know that that's what's occurring. And so this disclosure of abuse ends up abusing her more in this setting with clergy, but it can happen with therapists or even law enforcement officers or even the domestic violence shelter. So let's talk about some examples of possible ramifications of disclosing abuse, whether or not you know it's abuse. The women that listen to this podcast, they have done this because they didn't know it was abuse. So it wasn't their fault. They were absolutely trying to go for help. So they've understood the risks and ramifications more than the general population.
Anytime information gets back to somebody who's abusive, there is always going to be a risk for retaliation for having made a disclosure of any kind. I think one of the first things anybody listening to this podcast should ask anybody they go to for help is, I need to say something to you, I need to tell you something, but I need to know under what circumstances would you share any bit of my disclosure with somebody else, including my partner? Because if they can't say to you, we will not disclose anything unless we have your specific written permission to make a disclosure, we are not going to make a disclosure because it is not safe. Abusers, when they know that they're being outed, they react potentially a few ways, but the ones that I can think of immediately is they come back at you with anger, and their anger is always dangerous, or they start spreading lies about you. I call it, she's the bitter, violent, lying, lazy, crazy, drunken, drug and money grubbing slut defense. Or I call it building social equity. They try to collect as many flying monkeys around them so that they can start discrediting you and what your perspective is, leaving you feeling very isolated and alone. It's never a good response. So disclosure, like even to somebody you think you can trust, you have to ask, what would you potentially do with disclosures that I make? Because it's important, really important for your own physical and emotional safety, that you have an idea of what's happening to that disclosure after it's made.
Now, disclosure is a very fraught word here at BTR because any listener who has gone through pornography addiction recovery with the abuser, part of that is usually that the therapist wants to do a disclosure with the perpetrator to write down all of his porn use, affairs, all of his compulsive sexual behavior. So they'll list it all out and they'll say, okay, we're going to do this therapeutic disclosure. And they don't identify the victim and the perpetrator because both of them are victims of the addiction, so to speak.
That's really a thing.
This is really a thing. Yeah.
I'm horrified by what you just said.
Yeah, it's really a thing. So basically the therapist says to her, this is going to be hard for him. We need to support him through this disclosure. They might do like a therapeutic polygraph at the end, which we do not recommend because they do not help. Like she is the ultimate decision maker about if she is safe, if she feels safe. And a lot of times after that polygraph, the therapist is like, well, he's told us everything and the polygraph has confirmed it. So I don't know why you're feeling stressed still. He's doing great. Now, I guess we have to deal with your trauma, as in you're a problem because you feel this trauma and the trauma is the problem, not his abuse. And so now you become like this crazy person because he's fine and he's done everything he's supposed to do and you're still suffering
That is the ultimate systemic gaslighting, and I want to vomit right now.
Yeah, it's really, really bad. I want to acknowledge that as women are listening, because many of them have maybe either considered this pornography addiction recovery therapeutic disclosure, or someone has suggested it to them. That word disclosure in and of itself can be very triggering for victims of abuse in this setting, in this context. So she's talking about reporting the abuse, which is probably the word I would use here so that we don't get it confused with therapeutic disclosure, and then make sure that the person that you report to is a safe person. That is key. So we have a Living Free workshop that really helps women decipher who is safe and who is not when they start their journey to safety, so that they're not accidentally reporting the abuse to someone. It could even be a neighbor who is going to get back to him about what's going on.
Can I give you an example of what something safe might sound like?
Sure, yeah.
This is the conversation that I have with everybody who calls me from the very moment the phone rings, and I pick up the phone and I say, like, listen, before we get into what you want to tell me about, there are a couple things I want you to know about me. First and foremost, I believe you. You don't have to convince me of anything. I know that if you're reaching out to me, it's because you are in a storm of unsafety for yourself and or your kids, and that you are so desperate that you need support. I let them know right from the beginning, I believe you. Like, there's no having to tell me anything that you don't want to tell me in order to make me get to a place where I believe you. And anybody who would qualify their statement by saying, like, I have to check in with the other person. No, you don't. No, you do not. Nobody likes to identify themselves as victims, least of all victims, because there's no crown at the end of victimization. There isn't anybody giving us a standing ovation. Nobody likes to identify as a victim. So when somebody goes and says, I'm being victimized by somebody, we, the society around them, needs to say, okay, we believe you. How can we help you?
Absolutely. If you are having to twist yourself in all kinds of different ways to get someone to believe you, they are not safe.
They are not a safe person. Yeah.
That's a good one. If they have to check in with the other person, or are they thinking, okay, well, this is this side of the story, but every story has two sides. So
it takes two to tango. Yeah.
It only takes one to not tango. So I mentioned this before when I was talking about how sometimes I talk to victims and they tell me that part of their story, and it includes some victim blaming, or it includes some of the abuse that they've experienced that they don't recognize is abuse. So they're parroting the abuse. Again, not their fault. They don't understand what's happening. They believe certain things about themselves due to the abuse. And so their experience, when they describe it, usually a therapist's role is to validate that and help them move through that. So how do we validate and support victims and their lived experience while also educating them about abuse and what has happened to them?
And I think that this goes back to the concept I was talking about earlier, where I was saying, I have them share their experiences in their words to me. Then I will ask permission. Would it be okay if I reframe this? You're telling me that he forces you to have sexual relations when you're feeling sick or when you're not really feeling up to feeling loving. Can I reframe that for you? In most states, that would be considered sexual assault, even if you're married or even if you're in partnership. So if you're not feeling up to having sexual relations, if you're feeling sick or if you're feeling tired and you haven't given consent, that is a form of sexual assault. That's many times how this conversation comes to me, is because the women that I talk with are telling me all kinds of examples of how their partner refused to take no for an answer. And they're ticking off just about every checkbox that there is regarding sexual assault, and yet they won't call it sexual assault. And so for me to be able to say, like, "Hey, is it okay if I reframe this for you and give you my perspective on it?" If they're like, no, like, I had a survivor once who was very angry with me because she absolutely 100% believed that she was codependent with her perpetrator. And it was a Facebook conversation. I said, I'd like to reframe this for you. This is why codependency is problematic. It is a victim blaming concept. And that victim, she blocked me. After getting very upset with me and explaining her reasonings, why it made sense to her. Sure, I make mistakes. It's important that I acknowledge them because I needed to hear why that perspective was important to her. But I still think that it is also appropriate to allow for that reframing so that they can start shifting their understanding, because as their lack of understanding leaves them in abuse, it may for other people that they come in contact with also. And so it's really about just making sure that we're gently educating as long as somebody has the capacity to hear it. If they don't have that capacity yet, it's okay to let it be for now and just encourage them to get other perspectives and other education. Sometimes they hang on to that perspective out of a survival mechanism or a survival skill, and we don't want to take away what is helping them survive.
I can see better now that I am post abuse.
Yes.
But I do remember being there. I remember people saying little things to me and me like kind of pushing it away or thinking that that wasn't really the case, only to realize later, like, oh, that really was it. And it was a survival mechanism for me. And it is for all survivors.
Another reframe that I ask people to do a lot is that concept of that idea of, well, that victim is lying to me.
Right.
And I'm not going to help her because she's lying to me. And I say to the person who's saying that, the person who wants to be the helper, can we please reframe that? Can we please think about it as she's not ready to trust you yet, as opposed to she's lying to me? And when I think of it that way, when I say this person isn't ready to trust me yet, I can go back to them and say, listen, I can understand that you don't know if I'm a trustworthy person or not yet. If you don't want to tell me something, it's okay. If I ask you a question, it's never to deny your experience or it's never to challenge you. It's only to make sure I fully understand what's happening so I can get you to the best help possible. But if you don't trust me with information, it's okay to keep it to yourself until you feel I am trustworthy. That just allows women to just like have this whole big burden roll off their shoulders. Like, she's not going to accuse me of lying, because I, as a helper person, no matter how good my intentions are, until they understand who I am and how I work, I don't get the privilege of automatic access to their victimization story. It's really kind of bold of me to think that I might, and important that victims have the right to edit their stories by how safe they are feeling in my presence.
Thank you so much for the work you do. You are incredible, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. Kathy's going to be back on the podcast talking about a few other topics. We're going to be talking about how kids become abuser aligned through the abuser's gaslighting and manipulation of the children. We're also going to be talking about the unique challenges and heartaches and hardships of mothers who are being accused of quote unquote parental alienation in order for the abuser to maintain control and maintain the ability to coercively control her and her children. We are going to cover those topics in a few months, so stay tuned because she is an amazing advocate and has so much to share with you. Her website is motherjusticenetwork.org. Kathy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Anne. You do amazing work too.
If this podcast is helpful to you, please help us reach other women by following or subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating. Thank you for helping other women find us. If you've already purchased a copy of my book, Trauma Mama, Husband Drama, please circle back and give it a 5-star rating. A lot of women are searching for books about betrayal trauma on Amazon, and rating Trauma Mama will help them find this podcast, which is free to everyone. Your donations keep this podcast going. Go to our website, btr.org, scroll to the bottom, click on Support the BTR Podcast. And until next week, stay safe out there.